Today's daf we're going to learn is Eruvin Tet Zayin. We're going to start right at the bottom. Tashma, if you remember, we started a Mishnah about a shayara, a caravan of people that came and settled they sat down in an area and they wanted to make a mechitza. So what did they use? Their implements that they had with them, their animal gear, you can say. And what did we say? It had to be geder gavo asarat tvachim, and there can't be openings greater than the standing parts. Okay, so then we had a machloket in the Mishnah. What if it was equal? Here it said greater than. What if it was exactly equal? So would that be okay? Rav Papa said yes, it would be okay. And Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua said it wouldn't be okay. What we did yesterday is we brought two potential proofs for Rav Papa. One we said really was a proof for Rav Papa. The other one, which was our Mishnah. The other one we said was, and we're going to come back to that our Mishnah is a proof for Rav Papa. The second one we gave answers to, and now we're going to flip. And we're going to say, let's bring some sources. We're going to bring three sources that seems to strengthen Rav Huna's position, Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua, and seems to go against Rav Papa. Okay, we're going to do the first two. Within the second one, we're going to get off on a long, not exactly tangent, but it's going to be a bit of a back and forth. We're going to start with saying it's a problem on Rav Huna. Then we're going to say, oh, maybe it's a problem on Rav Papa. And I'm sorry, it's a proof for Rav Huna. And then they're going to say, oh, maybe it's a proof for Rav Papa, and actually it's difficult for Rav Huna. And we're going to go a little bit back and forth till we kind of conclude what we conclude there. And then we're going to have the third source. So Tashma, starting from two lines from the bottom of Tefaf Amabet. Let's learn from here. Shayara shechanta bebik'a, b'kifua b'gmalim, b'uchafot, b'abitin, b'shlifim, b'kanim, b'kochot. Okay, this is very similar to our Mishnah. A caravan comes to a place, into a big valley, and they surround it with either their camels or their saddles, or, by the way, we had this whole discussion yesterday. I just wanted to briefly mention about the get and writing it on an animal. So Shuli Mishkin's article this week in Flashback, her column on Hadron's site, is all about what utensils what did people write on in those days. And it's a very interesting historical piece about what people use for writing, right? Obviously, we think it's absurd to write on an animal, but in those days, they used all sorts of things for writing. Anyway, it's a good read about those topics. So now, shayara shechanta bebik'a kifua bigmalim, with camels, with saddles, with avitim, which are saddle pillows, saddle cushions. Bishlifin, okay, this could be stalks of wheat or something. Bikanim, with wooden boards or reeds. It's sometimes translated differently in different places. Bikochot, with stalks of vegetables. Okay, so whatever you did with these, and we're going to come back to this later, they're standing. Okay, later we're going to talk about what if they're horizontal. Here they're vertical. Mitaltalim betocha ubevad shelo yehe. Here comes the key part. You can carry in here as long as, what don't you have? As long as you don't have bein gamal legamal kimelo gamal. Ubein ukaf ukaf kimelo ukaf. Ubein avi lavi kimelo avi. Okay, they stop here, but they can obviously say this for all. As long as you don't have empty space the same size as the standing space. So this makes it sound like if it were exactly equal, it's no good, right? Because it says as long as it doesn't have the same amount of open space as there is closed space. So that seems to go against Rav Papa's support for Rav Huna, who says if it's equal, it's no good. So hachanami, what can we answer here? Just like we said before, kishenifnas v'yotze. What are we talking about? In order, like we talked about the books in the bookshelf yesterday, in order to fit it in, to have the equal space empty, if you want to, let's say, to talk about filling in the empty space, you would need it to be a little bit wider. So what they mean really here is that the open spaces aren't a little bit wider than the closed spaces. And then it would work, and then it doesn't contradict Rav Papa. Next source. This source is a little bit longer, a little bit more complicated. And as I said, we're going to get a little bit off from this into, we're going to do a lot of back and forth. It's going to start off as a support for Rav Huna, Bered Rav Yoshua. Then it's going to kind of flip back and forth. Is this work better with one, work better with the other? We'll see. This sets up, okay, it's a Tosefta in Kilayim. Remember, Tosefta is what Rabbi Yechiya put together. It's like his book of Mishnah. It's usually a little more detailed than our Mishnah, and it sometimes has obviously different approaches that are mentioned in our Mishnah. This is on the topic of Kilayim, which is planting next to a vineyard, planting crops like wheat next to a vineyard. And again, what do you need? A mechitza. You need some sort of wall, separate. There's other ways to do it. You can have space, or you can have a wall. If there's a wall, then it's clear. The question is, what constitutes a wall. It's the same thing as by us, right? A mechitza, a separation. So here it says, Nimtzeta ta'omer, shalosh midot b'mechitzot. There's 3 different measurements of what your wall can be, and the laws are going to be different for each one. We're going to start with very narrow, wider boards that you're using for your wall, or whatever it might be that you're using, and even wider than that. So we start off with pachot mishlosha. If each one is less than 3, tzarich shelo yehe ben ze lezeh shlosha. This is our classic din of levud. Okay, if you have an animal, what's your issue? Remember we talked about it has to be less than 3 off the ground. If it's within 3 off the ground, there's a space, we're not worried because the little goats can't run through there. Likewise, if it's vertical posts standing, if it's less than 3 in between each vertical post, as you see in this picture number 116, the animal can't fit through the posts, right? It's too narrow. So if it's less than 3, what do we say? Each beam is less than 3. We assume if you have space less than 3 in between, we use din levud, and it's as if it's a solid wall. And that works. Okay, so that's one type of wall. Umishlosha va'ad arba'a, if it's from 3 tvachim till 4 tvachim, this is the next picture, okay, in 117, if your posts are 3 tvachim or 4 tvachim wide, what's the criteria? You can't have the empty spaces being the exact same size as the solid spaces. This seems to be, by the way, against Rav Papa. This is the important part because it sounds like if it's equal, it's no good. So that, and here it says it explicitly. So your openings can't be this, your breaches can't be the same size as your standing boards, your standing wall. Now here comes the difference between this and the next section, because the next section is going to be even bigger, right? If it's more than 4 tvachim, here there's going to be a minor difference. If it's more breached than solid, than standing, the entire mechitza doesn't count for anything, okay? Your mechitza is canceled. Kol shehu arba'a, category number 3. If it's 4, ume arba'a vad 10 amot, from 4 up until 10 amot, tzarich shelo yehe ben ze lezeh kimlo'o. So number 1, same as before. You can't have breaches that are as wide as the standing space. Shelo yehe parutz ke'omed, so that the breaches aren't the same as the standing parts. Ve'im haya parutz ke'omed, what if it was exactly equal? Then, keneged ha'omed mutal, keneged ha'parutz asur. If it was 50-50, you'd be allowed to carry, not carry, now we're not talking about carrying, you'd be allowed to plant on the other side of where there's a standing wall. Because this is already more than 4 tvachim, or 4 tvachim or more, it's already, these boards are significant. There's no picture, but these boards are significant, and therefore you can plant on the other side of them. You just can't plant where the wall is breached. So we can't view this as one long wall, but we can view it as there's partitions in different places, and you can plant on the other side of them. Until what point? Im haya omed meruba ala parutz, af keneged parutz mutar. So first of all, if the standing part in the entire wall, you have more parts standing than breached, then even by the breached part, you'd be allowed to carry. And nifritza yoter me'eser asur. Unless what? Unless, let's say you have a 25 cubit wall, of it, 12 is standing, 13 are breached, right? Remember, once your breach is bigger than 10, then already, I'm sorry, I said it wrong. I want to say 13 is standing, 12 is breached. That's not going to be good. Even though you have more standing than breached, since the breach is larger than 10 cubits, we've already said, that means it's no longer a petach. No one goes, right? The gates aren't that wide. Learned from the chatz, right? The gate to the hechal, and therefore it's not going to work either. Okay, so a bunch of different options about how this works, unless, okay, one more thing. So nifritza yoter me'eser asur, but hayusham kanim hadok kanim, if you had beams that were kind of, dokhanim comes from stab. They were kind of stabbed into the ground. They had like it was pokey at the bottom and you were able to stick it into the ground using that. Oseh lahem pe'ah milamala. Okay, then afilu biyoter me'eser mutal. If you then braided the top part, remember you could braid the top part. So if you braided the vine across the top, then that would be allowed even if the opening was more than 10. Now, why is that? Let's remember. What's the reason? Because it's a tzurat hapetach. Remember? Once you have a tzurat hapetach, this is back to the first Mishnah, even if the breach is more than 10, it's fine. So now what do you see? You see that, first of all, a few things. One thing I forgot to mention when we talked about tzurat hapetach. Tzurat hapetach is not the same as a korah, right? A tzurat hapetach is made up of two lechis and a korah, two posts and a beam going across. The beam, we said, was a minimum of a tefach. But once you have a tzurat hapetach, which is two beams and two posts and a beam going across, the beam doesn't need to have a tefach of thickness to it. That's why our eruvs are made with strings, very thin strings, because our eruvs are made of tzurot hapetachs, not korot. We don't use just a korah. We use tzurat hapetach. Because of that, it doesn't need the thickness of a beam. It doesn't need to be a tefach. Okay, so that's an important point to say. This is a tzurat hapetach. Once it's tzurat hapetach, right, this geffen clearly isn't a tefach in thick, or doesn't have to be a tefach in thickness, and therefore, because it's tzurat hapetach, it allows something that's even 10 amot wide. Okay, we've gotten a lot off the topic here, but I'm gonna, we're gonna go back now to why we quoted this in the first place, because we got into a lot of ins and outs of different things. So just to review the Tosefta. Tosefta starts off with less than 3, right? Then we went to 3 to 4, and then we went to 4 or more, right? Once it's 4 or more, we're going to be more lenient, okay? And we're going to allow certain things that we wouldn't allow in the other cases. But the main thing for our purposes was this line, katane miyat. They're realizing that you don't even remember why we brought this. So they're reminding you. In fact, it says here, reisha mishlosha va'ad arba'a, right? In the middle case, okay? In the reisha. Now, reisha is going to be used to mean many things here. There's 3 parts of the Tosefta. Theoretically, they should really call them reisha, which means first part of the Braita, mitziata, which means the middle part of the Braita, like Bava Mitzia is the middle mesechet of all the Bavas, or should say seifa, which is the third part. But they're going to use reisha and seifa. Reisha and seifa generally mean first and last, but first and last can be relative. They can be saying first compared to last, okay? Meaning second compared to third. So the second would be, right, the middle part would be called the first. And if it's relating to the last part, then the last is called the last. Sometimes they're going to say reisha and seifa are the first and the second part, because the second part compared to the first part is the seifa, because it's the second part. So it's going to be used interchangeably here, which just confuses things a little, but I'll make it clear. So in the reisha, which is really the middle part, it says, mishlosha va'ad arba'a, u'belvad shelo yehe ben zeh lezeh kimlo'o. That's a tiyuv to the Rav Papa. When we read it, I pointed that out. It says as long as the spaces aren't equal. If they're equal, it's a problem. So Amar l'cha Rav Papa, what's he going to answer? What we keep answering, my melo'o nichnas v'yotzeh. We mean where it's a little bit wider, where it's the same size that you could theoretically fit the same amount of things inside, but you would need a little bit of a wider space in order to do that, and that resolves it. And they say, in fact, that seems to be logical. Hakinami mistaber, we can further prove it, because it says, midikatane, imaya parutz meruba al haomed, af keneged haomed asur. What did we say about that case? You can't use even the standing part of that wall if it's 3 to 4 tefachim each part of the wall. Even the standing part, it's forbidden to use the part opposite it, right? Which is different from once it's 4. Once it's 4, you can plant in the part where there's a standing wall, even if there's pirtzot. But if the parutz was more than the omed, if it was breached more than, notice it says more than, not equal to, then you can't even plant even by the standing parts. So therefore, it sounds like hake omed, if it was standing, if it was equal, the breached and the open part, the standing part, it would be mutar. It would be allowed, shma mina. Okay, so right now they started with saying this is contradiction to Rav Papa, and then they said, no, the words have improved. Sounds like Rav Papa from a different part of it. So now the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, let's flip it then. then this should be a contradiction for Rav Huna's position. The Perutzka Omed is a problem. So Amar Lecha, what can Rav Huna answer you? V'litamech ema seifa. He's going to quote you the latter part of the Braita, the last part, the third part. What does it say there? And that's going to support his opinion. Im haya omed meruba la parutz, af keneged haparutz mutal. It said, if the standing part was greater than the breached, then you could carry even by the breached part, because again, we view it as a wall. Now notice what it says there. Omed meruba, if the standing part is greater than the breached part, which sounds like if they were equal, it would be forbidden, right? Ha kiparutz asur. So now they're going to say, basically, we're a little bit stuck because Seifa, part number 3, is Kasha Rav Papa, and Reisha, Kasha Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yoshua. And part number 2, they're calling the Reisha now, part number 2, is problematic according to Rav Huna B'Rav Yoshua, right? Because each one, what's the problem? Each one talks about if this is greater than that, if this is greater than that. Nobody talks about equal. So you can infer from each time it says if this is greater than that, you can infer something opposite about the equal. So therefore, we're a little bit stuck. So the typical Gemara answer to how to understand the Mishnah is let's look at the Mishnah as a literary structure. And when you have something that has literary, it's written in a manner that's supposed to be viewed as, a text that's read well, like nicely from a literary perspective. So we can make certain assumptions. Instead of assuming because it says this, we can derive that. No, it was written that way for literary purposes. Okay, how so? We're going to explain it each one according to their opinion. L'Rav Papa lo kasha. I did Tani Reisha because in the second part of the Mishnah, it's bright Tosefta. It said parutz meruba la omed, and there it meant literally because equal would be okay. Tana Seifa omed meruba la parutz. So they just had the language match the language of the other case. So there it said this is more than that. So the other one said if that's more than that. But it really wasn't that it was meant to be deriving anything from. And Reisha, we're going to say the opposite. L'Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yoshua lo kasha. Don't worry about the middle part being a difficulty for him, because he'll just say, I did buy them in a seifa. Or maybe Rubala Parutz in the seifa. They wanted to bring the case of if standing is more than, because then it would be allowed, but if it were equal, it wouldn't be allowed. Therefore, Tani Reisha Parutz Merubala Omed. Don't derive anything from the first part. That's just matching the language of the second part. And that's how we resolve any contradiction against either of them. And we're left with, we don't really know who this Braita supports because it could go either way. Now they say, Bishlam ala Rav Papa, but we have another way of showing that this Tosefta supports Rav Papa. How so? Remember, there's 3 parts. Part number 1, I'm going to deal with now with only part number 1 and part number 2. This case, the first section, the first whole dealing with the Tosefta was dealing with part number 2, and then we compared it to part number 3. So part number 2 was the Reisha, part number 3 was the Seifa. Now we're going to compare part number 1 and number 2. Part number 1, and now number 2 is going to be called the Seifa, because the Seifa compared to the Reisha of part number 1. So now we're going to say, we started with less than 3. What did we say? If each wooden piece is less than 3, and there's space of less than 3 in between, that works. More than 3 is a problem. Then we said if it's 3 to 4, then it just depends, right? It can't be more than or equal to, right? There was that's the whole debate. Either more than or equal to the amount that was standing. Okay, so what are we going to do with this? Bishlam ala Rav Papa. Mishum hachi lo arev lu v'tane lehu. The reason why section 1 is separate from section 2 makes a lot of sense, because section number 1, if you want to say equal to is okay, then section number 1, less than 3, it would have to be less than 3, right? And no more than that, because that would already be more. If you have 3 tvachim, you couldn't have, right? Less than is not a significant number. It would need to be 3, right? You want to say 3 is okay, right? Where 3 is not okay in case number 1 in this first section, because 3 is too much already. That's not levud, and it's more than what's standing. But in section number 2, 3 is actually going to be okay if your beam is 3. So 3 would work there, and it wouldn't work in section number 1, and that's why these 2 are separate. However, if you're Rav Huna, and now we're going to see, they should have mixed the 2 together and said them at the same time. What should they have mixed? They should have said like this. if he thinks that if you have 3 tvachim, what's he going to say about a breach? A breach of 3 tvachim is already a problem. It would have to be only a breach of less than 3 because parutz ke'omed is a problem. If that's the case, then less than 3 and 3 should actually be together. Okay, so let's read it. It should have put those two together and said, Kol shu pachot mishlosha vishlosha. If it's less than 3 and 3 tvachim exactly, then what's the magic number? Tzarich shelo yehe ben zeh lezeh shlosha. Right? It just can't be 3. Anything less than 3 is okay, both for 3 and for less than 3. But anything at 3 is going to be a problem for both. So therefore, the 3 should have been in the first section. So what's the answer? The answer is very simple. They're not together, not because it wouldn't be the same number. Number-wise, it would be the same. But from a theoretical perspective, these are coming for 2 totally different reasons. Now we're going to see. They're not the same disqualification. Psula dereisha, what's the reason why it's less than 3? Because of din levud. We just don't want the gdi being, right? We don't want it to be a wall that can be breached by an animal running through. Psula de seifa shelo yehe parutz ke'omed. But the psula in the second part of the 3 tvachim, if it's 3, it can't be 3 open. That's for a different reason. That's because it doesn't have to do with the gdi going through. It has to do with, right? Because then we could just call it a petach. That's an opening. That's fine. But that has nothing to do with levud. It's just that we can't have parutz merubah laomed. And that's why 3 doesn't work. And that's why 3 and 4 go together and less than 3 is separate. Because the logic behind it is something different. It's a different reason. Even though technically you could have put 3 together numerically or quantity-wise. Now they say, okay, we have one other problem with this Tosefta before we move on. Pachot mishlosha. Now, it said the whole thing was levud. Levud works less than 3, right? So pachot mishlosha mani, whose opinion is that? Rabbanan have. Why? Da amri pachot mishlosha amrin an levud. Shlosha lo amrin an levud. According to the rabbis, levud is only at less than 3, but not at 3. However, remember we saw Shita of Rashbag. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said it's 4. Remember, levud is up to 4 tvachim. So now they say, well, ema seifa, look at the later part of this Tosefta. It says, kol shu shlosha, umi shlosha ad arba'ah, which is, right, again, the later part here means the middle. Now, what is the significance of 4 tvachim according to the rabbis? Why is this middle case? This middle case, according to the rabbis, just should have been 3. What's this 3 and 4? The fact that they're bringing in 4 tvachim is a significant amount sounds like they hold like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, damar pachot me'arba'a levud. Sounds like it must be like Rashbag. Now it's a little bit tricky because they're not really using levud here, but I think what they're really, and the Mepharshim question this, it seems like what they're really trying to say is, where did 4 tvachim become any significant measure to the rabbis? It seems like it's only Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that shows significance to this number. So they say, Di'i Rabbanan mishlosha v'ad arba'ah. Why shlosha v'ad arba'ah? Shlosha v'ad arba'ah chadu. Once you're out of the range of levud, over 3, there should be no difference. 3, 4, 5, 6, right? It kind of doesn't matter. Why is this 3 and 4 in its own category? So Amar Abai, midreisha Rabbanan, seifa nami Rabbanan. Really, this whole thing is the rabbis, okay? Since the beginning is clearly the rabbis, because din levud is less than 3. This latter part must be also the rabbi's opinion. So how do you explain the issue of 4? Where does 4 come from? Umodu Rabbanan, they agree, by the way, that there is some significance to this 4 number. To call a mishra kenegdo, if you want to allow, now remember, what did we say? In the third situation, once it's 4 tvachim wide, what does that allow you? It allows you that if you have parutz merubah laomed, right? Breaches that are greater than the omed, we allow you to carry, we allow you to plant on the other side of where there is a standing wall. Now that's only allowed if your wall is 4 tvachim. So it has nothing to do with levud. They think that 4 tvachim has significance for that issue. Okay? So Moed Rabbanan de kol mishre kenegdo, in order to allow you to plant on the other side of this wall, just not by the breach parts. Remember, if you have omed merubah parutz, then you can view the entire thing as if it's a wall and plant everywhere. But once the breaches are greater, then you can't plant opposite the breaches, but you can plant opposite the walls. But that's only if the wall is 4 tvachim wide. That's why they make the distinction. Below, lo chashiv. And if it's not 4, it's not significant enough, and that's why you can't even plant opposite the standing parts. That's one answer. Rava takes the opposite approach. Shocking, he disagrees with Abaye, and he takes the approach. Amar mi desefer Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Reshanami Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. He says the whole thing is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, that it's 4 tvachim is lavud. Well then, and about this, because he basically claims the rabbis don't view 4 tvachim as a significant measure for anything. So therefore, this Tosefta can't match their opinion. And he says, if that's the case, so what do we do with din lavud is 3 tvachim? This we already know the answer. We saw this already. When he says 4 tvachim is lavud, hanimile lamala, that's only when you have issues up at a certain height, right? Where let's say your sukkah, your schach has gaps in between. If they're less than 10 tvachim, we can view it as solid, right? We can use lavud as, if it has less than 4 tvachim as the measurement when it's at a height. But lamata, but when we're talking about something on the ground, whether it be vertical openings or horizontal openings, what do we measure that by? By the gdiim, by these kids that are running through, right? The goat kids. That there we have an issue because we're worried, and therefore it's not going to work. Okay? So even Rashbag, who holds lavud is 4, only holds lavud is 4 when we're talking about at heights, not when we're talking about breaches in the ground. And this is all breaches in the ground. And therefore he would still say 3, less than 3, and not less than 4 for this case. And therefore, right, if it's a mechitza shagdim bo gimbo, lo amrin on lavud. Okay, that was all our second attempt to knock out Rav Papa's approach, and which we then flipped and tried to say maybe we can knock out Rav Huna, and we went back and forth, and we're done with that one. Now we're up to source number 3 against Rav Papa. Tashma. Tfanot halalu sherubam ptachim b'chalonot. Remember, we saw this if it's a wall that has openings, windows, and doorways, mutal. Ubevad shehei omed meruba ala parutz. Right? If the majority of it is these openings and windows, it's allowed as long as the standing part is more than the breach part. Then we asked the same question last time we saw the source. Sheruban sakadatach. How could it be the majority is openings, but the majority is standing? That makes absolutely no sense. Contradicts itself. Ela sheriba behem ptachim b'chalonot. If it had many windows and openings, not when doorways, not the majority was, but if it had many, then it's going to be mutal. But what does it say? Under what condition? Ubilvad sheyehei omed meruba al haparutz. What do you see from here? The standing part has to be more than, meaning equal is not going to be good enough. Hakiparutz asur. Therefore, if it's equal, it would be forbidden. Tiyuvta de Rav Papa. And in fact, they say tiyuvta. This, in fact, is a contradiction to Rav Papa. However, the Gemara now says, Hilchata kavate de Rav Papa. We hold like Rav Papa that it actually is okay if it's equal. So the Gemara says, Tiyuvta v'hilchata. How can you say that this source contradicts and yet we paskin like him? Generally, if something goes against Tanaitic source, we have an issue. They say, no, you can actually, mishum, and now we have to go back to yesterday, did daika magnitin kavate. The Mishnah was more like Rav Papa. Remember, we brought this as a question to Rav Huna and left it with this question against him. Ditznam, what does it say in our Mishnah? Lo yehu pirtzot yeterot al habinyan. In our Mishnah, it said that the openings won't be more than what's built, and that seems to imply ha kebinyan mutal. Okay, and that ends this section today where we basically, and here I would just want to summarize by saying, right, we had these two approaches. We tried to prove, right, one can be proven from our Mishnah, the other can be proven from a Braita, and this goes back to what we've been discussing for the last few days about how we determine psikat halacha. Okay, I don't know if you're figuring this out, but we're learning that there's no set answer for every situation. And sometimes, right, basically when they determine how to decide halacha, there's all sorts of issues that come into play. One is who the rabbi is, right? We had Rabbi Meir, he explained every side so well that it just became confusing and we couldn't follow, and therefore they didn't want to hold like him. We have Rabbi Yossi, who nimu ko imo, and because he was so clear, they wanted to hold like him. And here we have something entirely different, which is, well, if you have a Mishnah that supports one and a Braita that supports the other, since the Mishnah made it into the Mishnah and the Braita didn't make it into the Mishnah, so we're going to go with the Mishnah rather than a Braita. Okay, this is another criteria. So each time there's different things. We also saw, I forgot the other most important one, right? Go see what the people are doing. Now, by the way, I didn't really get into this because we were at the end of class already, but doesn't mean every time let's go out and see what the people are doing, and because the people are doing this, we could do that, right? It's like right, if your friend's jumping off the Empire State Building, you're going to jump off the Empire State Building, right? Just because people are doing it doesn't necessarily mean it's allowed. But it's used in certain situations where there's a lack of clarity and they're not really sure what was determined in the end. Then they say, let's go look and see what the people are doing, and that will be an indicator for us of what the halacha is, right? And then, of course, it becomes a question of which Amma are you looking at? Which groups of people are you looking at? Are you looking at people who generally keep halacha? You're looking at people who don't generally, right? Obviously, it would be, depends sort of who you're looking at and how you're determining. It's a whole big interesting thing about when we say that. They don't say it in all cases. They say it sometimes, and again, it all depends on, this is a method of using all different terminology at our disposal, right? There's also something called halacha kebatrai. Often we hold like the later person, even though the earlier people were considered greater scholars and knew more, but the later people understand all the earlier opinions and the situation nowadays, and we should therefore paskin like the later people. So like I said, there's many, many different factors that factor into how we paskin. What's interesting here is that we're getting a whole bunch of them in just a few small pages, right? We're getting a whole bunch of different elements about how we determine halacha. Okay, moving on to the next Mishnah. Now we're going to talk about making, so there we had standing rows that weren't basically connected, and could you connect them, right, through lavud? Now we're going to have horizontal ones. Okay, what if you have horizontal rows? Some people do this in their sukkah. They put these ropes up, okay, this comes from here. Okay, so you could put these 3 ropes around, okay, at different heights. As long, okay, they're going to say now, one above the other, as long as you don't have 3 tvachim. So you can basically create a wall with 3 ropes. Okay, we're going to see, do the ropes even have to have a minimum measurement? So according to the Mishnah, yes, we're going to raise a question on this in the Gemara. But as long as shiur chavalim va'ovyan yeter al tefach, kadei sheheh kol 10 tvachim. What are they assuming? So you have to leave less than 3 in between each one. So less than 3 off the ground, then a rope. Less than 3, rope, less than 3, rope. How much does that equal? Well, less than 3 times 3 is 9 minus a bit. So the ropes have to be at least 1 tefach and a bit so that it's greater than the height gets us to 10 tefachim. We have to get to exactly 10 tefachim. Gemara is going to question this, that maybe there's other ways to do this, but we'll get to that soon. Mikifim bekanim, ubavad shelo yehe ben kaneh lechavero 3 tefachim. Okay, you can use kanim, like these little thin posts, as long as you don't have 3 tefachim in between. B'shayara dibru, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Now we get into this interesting discussion. Notice this in the previous Mishnah talked about shayara. Okay, or the previous Mishnah talked about shayara, and the assumption is this is a continuation. So what's a shayara? A caravan, they get to a valley and they need a solution. There are a lot of people. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, this is only allowed when you're a lot of people in a caravan, not just for an individual who needs an eruv. They were just giving an example of a possible situation that would happen. They didn't mean only a caravan of people. Next thing. He says a mechitza has to have things going both horizontally and vertically. It's not enough for you just to have some ropes going horizontally or some posts going vertically. The rabbis say no, even one is sufficient. So comes Rav Hamnuna. The Gemara starts off with Rav Hamnuna. Amar Rav Hamnuna Amarav. Hare amru, omed meruba la parutz b'shti have omed. So I understand from the previous mission that omed meruba la parutz, right? You have standing more than breached. That will work, okay? B'shti, if it's standing. But by Rav Hamnuna be'erev mai. What about if it's horizontal? So now they're going to say, what do you mean, right? Amar Abaye tashma. Let's learn that exactly from our Mishnah. Now, what are we going to learn from our Mishnah? It's true that horizontal works, but horizontal here doesn't work. What he's really asking is, can you use lavud to basically create a solid wall? So we learned before you could, right? As long as there's less than 3 tvachim in between. But now he's going to say when it comes to horizontal, it might not be the case. Now, why not? So Abai says, Tashma, let's learn it from our Mishnah, that it actually doesn't work. Because shi'ur chavalim ve'ovyam yeter al tefach. The fact that they have to be a tefach is going to prove that if they weren't a tefach, it wouldn't work, even though theoretically you could get to 10 using lavud. How so? And you could use parutz, and the issue of omed merubala parutz together with lavud should get you a good wall, even without having to have the ropes be a tefach plus thick. I'll explain why in a minute, okay? So he says the fact that it says the chavalim have to be more than a tefach kadeshi or kol asara tefachim, v'ita, and if so, lama li yeter al tefach, li avid pachot mishlosha, v'chevel mashu, pachot mishlosha, v'chevel mashu, pachot mi'arba'a, v'chevel mashu. If you only need omeim merubah parutz, and you have din levud, theoretically, 2 walls of 3, right, 2 spaces of less than 3 with 2 ropes makes up 6. Now, if you have a space of 4, and then those 6, you actually can get to 10 without having to have, and now we're going to talk about the different formations, without having to have actually the ropes get you up to 10, because you can leave space off the ground. There can be this extra space of 4, which doesn't really count because it's empty, but yet, what did we assume? 3, 3, 3, and 3 ropes. 3, 3, 3 gets you to 9. Plus the ropes, right, 9 minus a little. The ropes, a tefach and a little, gets you to 10. He says you could do 4, 3, and 3, because you don't need it to be 3, 3, and 3, because omei merubala parutz should cover your 4 as long as you have 6. If that's the case, 4, 3, and 3, we all know equals 10, which means that you don't need any thickness in the ropes because you can get to some way. Well, now we're going to see maybe you really can't. So he basically says, why are you even asking this question? The fact that our Mishnah requires tefach shows you that it doesn't really work. You can't do omei merubala parutz and basically say, well, as long as there's 6, this wall, and there's 4 empty, this wall, or a little less than 4 empty, this wall can work, because otherwise you wouldn't need the thickness in the ropes. It would work anyway. So now they said, Abaye, what exactly do you mean? Because what won't really work in any of these ways you described. So let's read. So now they say, right? So they say, let's just read it again. If that's the case, why do I need yeter al tefach li avid pachot mishlosha? Right? You could do pachot mishlosha, chevel mashu, pachot mishlosha, chevel mashu, pachot mi'arba'a, chevel mashu. Okay, that should work. So now they say, v'tizbra, you really think that would work? Hi, pachot mi'arba'a, hechi mokim la. Where are you going to put that less than 4 part? I mokim la tatai. If you put it at the bottom, now here go all the pictures. Okay, so start looking at pictures. First we're in picture number 119, okay? If you put it at the bottom, we all know that doesn't work. Why doesn't that work? Because gedim bokimbo. So it can't be that you put the open space of 4 at the bottom. That won't work. Okay, we'll read it inside. Mokimle, right? If you're going to put it at the bottom, that for sure won't work. Imokimle Eli, let's say you put it at the top, okay? So at the top, you have a rope, 4 tvachim of space, rope, 3 tvachim, rope, 3. I don't mean 3, 4, I mean a bit less than. I'm just not going to say each time a bit less than. You all know it means a bit less than. So what's going to be the problem here? Well, we have a problem because above the 4 tvachim at the top is empty space, right? Because you have that's the end of it. And below it's empty space because remember, levud only works for the bottom 6. The bottom 6 are solid. But now you have empty space, rope, empty space. Now you can't use omei merubala parutz when you have empty space on 2 sides, okay? So basically, if your space you want to say is covered within your solid space, it's only if it's surrounded, at least on one side, with solid. Here it's got space, and that doesn't work. So it can't be it's at the top. So what are we left with? It would have to be, right, imokim le b'mitzia. That's also not going to work because there's a separate problem. And this is something we talked about in the past. Right? Your 4 is in the middle. And what you want to say is the less than 3 on the rope and the less than 3 on the rope, one's above it, one's below it, should overpower, right? They should say, oh, omei merubala parutz. This can basically say we have really a mechitza of 10 here. What's the problem? If you remember, we had this whole discussion when we talked about limiting a space of 15 amod, and we said you could put we had all those different cases of a pas of this and a pas of that to, right, 1.5, 2, and 1.5, that could make up the 5. And why did it say 3 and 2? And then we said, because when you can't necessarily, and this was a bit of a debate, can you say that 2 smaller override if the 2 of them together are bigger than the middle? Does that work or not? So they're going to say, since we don't have resolution to that question, you can't assume that our Mishnah means that, because it wouldn't, right? You couldn't say, oh, well, the fact the Mishnah didn't say this, because it obviously works. It doesn't obviously work because we're not sure it works. So that's what we're going to read. That's only when the less than 3 and less than 3 are greater than the 4, only if they work together. And since they're not together, but they're on opposite sides, it might not work. And therefore, shmat minan, and we don't really know that that's the case. So therefore, you can't suggest that. So we basically reject all of Abaya's suggestions. And then we're going to have to say that we're reshaping now Rav Hamnuna's question. We're now going to say, Rav Hamnuna haki kamibayle. This is really what Rav Hamnuna was asking. He wasn't asking, does Erev work, okay, to say Omei Merubala Parutz? But what he was asking is, Kigon de Aite, what he was really asking about was the following case. We're assuming that wouldn't work, okay? Because it's obvious from our Mishnah that doesn't work, because, right, we're going to now say what his real question was, he took, this is picture number 122. He took a mat of reeds and it was 7, okay? But then what did he do? He cut out, it was 7 v'mashu. It was 7 and a bit more. What did he do? He took the first 4, left it. Chakak bashlosha, v'shavik badale v'mashu. He left over 4 at the top and a mashu at the bottom. So you basically now have a space where there's 4 with a rope at the bottom or a reed or something, whatever it's made of. And then this empty space of less than 3 in the middle, okay? Or 3 in the middle, actually. So now we're going to say like this. And what's the issue? Your bottom part, right, it's less than 3 tvachim off the ground. You have a mashu, which is like the rope, with less than 3 off the bottom. So now we say levud. It's as if the 3 tvachim at the bottom, and you have the top is 4. You now have omei merubala parutz, and it doesn't, right? You have the 4 that can override the 3, so it's not like it's mishnei ruchot, and each one only together they're strong enough to overcome it. So therefore, what he wanted to know is, right, umashu v'ochme b'pachot mishlosha, right, and it was less than 3 off the ground. So that's what he said he was asking about. Would this work? That was Rav Hamnuna's question. That's one answer. Rav Ashi amar mechitza tluya ibaya lehu. Okay, Rav Ashi says, no, he was really talking about a mechitza tluya. Okay, again, both these answers don't really sound like what his question was. But the Gemara now assumes his question must have been something else because it doesn't make so much sense otherwise. And therefore they say, it was talking about the question, Kedabai mine Rav Tavla mirav, mechitza tluya ma'usha tatir b'churva, amarle ein mechitza tluya materet ela b'mayim, kal shikilu chachamim b'mayim. So that his question was exactly the same as what Rabbi Tavla asked Rav, which was if you have coming off a balcony, remember you have this wall of 10 tefachim tall, and then can it go down, right? And then he said that we only allow it for water, but we don't allow it for other purposes. And that must have been the question that Rav Hamnuna was asking Rav, and it wasn't actually a question about what we thought it was about. Now we're going to get to our shayara case. If you remember, Rabbi Yehuda said this case is only allowing, okay, again, we're talking about a mechitza gru'ah. It's not a great mechitza. It just works from din levud. You have just a few ropes going across. So Rabbi Yehuda said it's only in a shayara. So now the Gemara says, b'shayara im b'yachid lo, what only works for a shayara, not for an individual. B'hatanya, there's a brighter that says that Rabbi Yehuda allows it for individuals. How so? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kol mechitzot Shabbat, lo itiru liyachid yoter mibeit sa'atayim. All these flimsy, maybe that's a good word for them, right? Mechitza gru'ah, flimsy mechitzot. All these flimsy walls, they're only allowed for an individual if it's in a space that's less than or not more than beit sa'atayim, which sounds like what? If it's less than beit sa'atayim, it does work for a yachid. By the way, this beit sa'atayim comes from, it's the size of the chatzer of the Mishkan. Okay, they learned it from there, which was 5,000 square amot. Okay, how are they going to learn this? Now they're going to answer. Rav Nachman said that they said in a different case, which we're going to see in a minute, that they only allowed them what they needed. Okay, so hachanami, we're going to say the same thing here. Litem lahen kol tzarkan. In other words, he allowed, when Rabbi Yehuda said he allows it for a shayra, not for an individual, he only allows the individual what the individual needs. Okay, so how are we going to know? Hechi itmar de Rav Nachman. Where did it say v'itema Rabbi Rabbi? Whichever one of them said it. Ahaditnan. It was said about the following Mishnah. Kol mechitza, and it's our Mishnah. Kol mechitza she'ena shel shti ve'erev ena mechitza divrei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. It has to be both vertical and horizontal things going across. It can't be open, right? Either open vertically or open horizontally. Umi amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda hachi. Did he really say that? V'hatanya. There's a brayta that says echad yachid ve'echad shayara lechabalim. Uma ben yachid l'shayara. In other words, both a yachid and a shayara can use ropes. So what's the difference between the yachid l'shayara? If so, well, yachid notnim lo beit sa'atayim, shnayim notnim lem beit sa'atayim. If you have one person, they get 2 se'ah. If you have 2 people, they get 2 se'ah. Once nasu shayara notnim lem beit shesh. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. V'chachamim obrim echad yachid ve'echad shayara notnim lem kol tzarkan. They get everything. Ubevad shelo yehe beit sa'atayim panui. As long as they don't have the space of Beit Sa'atayim that nobody's using, they get whatever they need, okay, which could be more than Beit Sa'atayim. So Amarav, now what was the problem? The problem was, how could Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda by us say, if it's not Shel Shtiva Erev, it's not a Mechitza? And there he said, it's limited in space, but it does work as a Mechitza. So the answer is, Amarav Nachman v'itein Rabbi Rabbi, lo nitzrocha ela litein len kol tzarkan. The reason was to allow that, in other words, it means, well, you can get up to a certain amount of space if you really need it for your purposes, for what you need it for. So therefore, with that, we're going to say that same issue is going to resolve our contradiction with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda seemed to say by us it only works by a shayara, and now they're learning that if Yachid needs, he gets what he needs, okay? He gets certain things, but not more than that, okay? We'll continue with this tomorrow, and we'll see, very interesting thing, that Rav Nachman actually becomes corrected and changes his mind. Interesting for thoughts for Elul. We'll start with that tomorrow. Okay. Have a good day, everybody.